Welcome to another episode of Healthy, Wealthy, and Wise Retirement Podcast, where certified financial planner Lauren Sherman shares thoughts on having a healthy mind, body, and spirit, an abundance of wealth inside portfolios and out, and lessons learned from clients and mentors over the years.
Welcome in for another Healthy, Wealthy, and Wise Retirement. I am your host, Lauren Sherman, and today we are bringing you part 2 with our special guest, Gary Zimmerman. If you missed part 1, be sure to have a listen to that one first, but as a quick refresher, Gary Zimmerman is the founder and CEO of a company called MaxMyInterest, which has a mission for helping Americans earn more while keeping their cash safe. We had a lot of great feedback from part 1, so I hope you enjoy the rest of our conversation just as much. With that, let's jump into the show. You've already alluded to this a little bit when you talked about the power of compounding interest over time. In your experience, what has been the long-term impact of optimizing cash returns for members?
So we benchmark against a few different metrics. One is the FDIC's national savings average. And then the other is just the average of the leading online banks, because there are many online banks that spend a lot of money on advertising. And so we've done back testing analyses. We've looked at how Max has performed relative to those online banks. In theory, we ought to do as well as the online banks, or maybe a little bit better because of the rebalancing. But along the way, we found that banks were willing to offer our customers preferential rates that they didn't advertise to the general public. And because of that, we're now able to significantly outperform even the online banks that you see advertising. So as an example, and there's a link to this on our website, which is maxmyinterest.com. But if you look since inception over the last 9 years, we outperformed the leading online banks by just under 20 basis points. Last year, we outperformed the online banks by about 50 basis points, or about half of 1 percentage point. At present, we're outperforming the online banks by 145 basis points, or 1.45%. And we're outperforming the national savings average by, about 4.7%. So these are very big differences, especially compounded over time. And it's not to say you have to do this. You could certainly keep all of your money at your existing bank, but if so, you're sort of giving up free money. It's sort of like you're intentionally driving to the most expensive gas station instead of looking for the least expensive gas station. And the nice thing about Max is you don't have to drive anywhere. You can access all of this from your computer.
When you put it that way, that makes a lot of sense. I've heard you talk a little bit about the relationship between cash and happiness. Can you expand on this for our listeners?
Sure. There's actually some really interesting research out of the UK on this. And, there's this old adage, money can't buy happiness. And that's true. The research shows that having more money does not make you happier beyond a certain level, as long as you have enough to meet your basic needs and you don't have the stress of worrying about, can I buy clothing and food? But beyond a certain income level, money does not make you happier. However, what the research shows is that the percentage of your assets that you keep in cash can make you happier. And it's kind of a funny thing, right? You might say, well, why does that matter? Why does the percentage matter, not the aggregate level? And we believe the answer is because cash is sort of a proxy for peace of mind, right? Knowing that you have that cash cushion to withstand an unexpected event, to withstand market volatility, helps you sleep better at night and feel more secure. And for people who are still working, if you've ever worked for a boss who maybe wasn't your favorite person in the world, if you are in a tight financial circumstance, you might feel trapped that, I don't like working for this person, but I have to. If you have that extra cash cushion, you know that you could quit that job and have the flexibility to, spend a little bit of time figuring out what the next right thing is for you and maybe work for someone who's a little bit more pleasant. It's not to say that you will quit your job, but simply knowing that you could quit your job makes you feel less trapped and thus happier. So there are probably a couple of different reasons for it. But I thought it was fascinating that it doesn't matter how much money you have, but holding a larger percentage of your assets in cash can make you feel happier.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'd like to dive into the relationship between money and happiness. We did a 2-part review of the book called Happy Money, The Science of Smarter Spending. And I found that really interesting. It was a lot about kind of like you're saying, it's just people need to spend their money in more intentional ways. It's not that, money isn't buying happiness, but maybe there's a little bit of a correlation there depending on how you view and how you spend your money.
Well, it's really funny that you mentioned that book because that was co-written by a college classmate of mine, Liz Dunn. She's a professor of happiness at UBC, University of British Columbia up in Canada. And her research is fascinating.
Oh, that's cool. So another question that might be on people's minds, I think maybe this is a little bit of a newer concept for some of our listeners, but they may be wondering, does Max My Interest have any competitors?
Yeah, absolutely. But we think of our competitors a little bit differently because there's no one who actually does what we do the way that we do it. We've spent about 10 years building out the software, and we now have 5 patents to our name. So there's no one who does what we do the way that we do it. But that doesn't mean we don't have competitors. But we think of our competitors as really being more concepts. And those concepts are awareness, apathy, and inertia. And if you think about each of those, what does awareness mean? Well, awareness is, gee, I didn't even know that I could be earning better returns on my cash. Well, that's why people, listen into your podcast so that they can learn more about how to be smarter about their money. So overcoming awareness is actually a really important friction. And there was actually a really interesting piece that Dion Rabouin wrote in the Wall Street Journal back in December about just how much money was sitting on the sidelines and just how much money people were, basically how much interest income Americans were missing out on. And I think he calculated it was something like $40 billion a quarter. So $160 billion a year of interest income is what Americans are missing out on simply because they're kind of lazy with their cash and it just sort of sits where it sits. So overcoming awareness is really important. The next thing we think of as our competitor is apathy, which is, okay, now you've told me that I could do better with my cash. I just don't care. Really? Do you really not care? That's kind of an interesting one to unpack. Because I know when I go to the grocery store, I still compare the price of 2 different tins of peas, right? And maybe no one else does that anymore. I still do that. And because I do care. And, I think of sort of money as being fungible, and every dollar that I don't earn here, I can't spend there, or I can't save, or I can't invest. So, the whole apathy thing is an interesting one to unpack. But historically, when people kept their money at broker dealers rather than with registered investment advisors, the broker dealers actually make the majority of their profit by earning spread on idle cash in client accounts. So when clients would ask their broker, oh, what should I do with the cash in my brokerage account? They would say, oh, you don't need to worry about that. But really what they're doing is they're just protecting the cash that they can then turn around and lend and make money on. So the nice thing about registered investment advisors or financial planners is that they're fiduciaries. They have a legal responsibility to do what's best for you. That's different than a broker who's really a salesperson. And so working with a fiduciary is really important because you know that they have your best interest at heart. And that's actually our slogan, Max, your best interest. There's a little, double meaning there, but it's really important to us because that's what we stand for and why we exist. We didn't start the company because we wanted to start a company and make money. We started the company because we saw a massive inefficiency in the market and wanted to see if we could solve it. So the third competitor is inertia, which is, okay, now I'm aware and now I care, but gee, there are so many other things on my to-do list. And gosh, inertia is such a powerful competitor. It's such a powerful force because chances are that after you finish listening to this podcast, you're going to go make dinner, you're going to go, to a concert or go do something else. And this will fall down that to-do list. And it might be there, but it'll never quite reach the top of the list. And every day that you don't start doing better with your cash, whether you use our software or whether you just go open one online savings account yourself, we just want you to do better. But overcoming that inertia is really important. So that's sort of what we think of as our 3 biggest competitors. And that is really why Americans are missing out on so many billions and tens of billions of dollars of interest income every month, is because of those 3 forces.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Before we hit the record button here, we were talking a little bit about how I've designed our firm, and we run into a lot of this too, because whether it's a client that is with the financial advisor that is not a fiduciary, or maybe an advisor that doesn't do tax planning, or many advisors charge a percentage of assets and you pay that advisor more when you have a bigger portfolio. And of course, we have a flat fee, so it doesn't matter the size of your portfolio, the fee's the same. And sometimes when we share that with people, it is a little bit of that apathy of, well, I know I could do better, but, or I think inertia, like I mentioned before, that's very powerful. It's hard for us as it's just kind of built into the human psyche that we stay where we are a lot of times unless we get a large enough nudge to move, right?
And that's why you have a professional financial advisor or planner to work with you. And the same reason that, a lot of people are not going to get around to doing the health screenings they need to do unless their doctor nudges them, right? Your doctor is there because your doctor is looking out for what's best for you. And they're there to sort of give you that extra guidance or nudge. And the same is true when you've got a great financial planner.
I think you bring up a doctor. I think perhaps dentists have perfected this because they always schedule your next appointment before you can leave the office. Well, you've created something in MaxMyInterest that is, I would say, a little contrarian to industry standards. You could say swimming against the current, if you will. Was this by accident, or have you always had a knack for maybe kind of going against the grain, even when it's unpopular?
Well, I don't know that I'm not sure I would say I go against the grain, but from a very young age, my parents instilled it in my sister and I, a great degree of intellectual curiosity. And so from kindergarten, every year from kindergarten until I graduated high school, in our family, we both did science fair projects. And there didn't even have to be a science fair, but my mother was a computer scientist and my father's a researcher and a research librarian. And so we sort of grew up in a house full of books and full of concepts and full of curiosity. And so every year we had to pick a topic, whatever was on our mind, whatever we were curious about, and study it and go in depth and then ultimately be able to do research and present on it. And I think that was really helpful because, this company to me kind of feels like a science fair project. Like we had this hypothesis, gee, the market is really inefficient, and could it be made more efficient? And could we make everyone better off as a result? And then we had to sort of, find our materials and supplies and figure out how to construct an experiment. And lo and behold, the experiment was far more successful than we ever thought it would be. And, we're still in the observations phase, but we're starting to form some conclusions. So I think that sort of framework stuck with me throughout life. And I think, that sort of approach, I don't know if I would call it contrarian per se, but that idea of if something puzzles you, go wrestle it to the ground and try to figure out why the world is the way it is. And maybe the world is the way it is for a good reason, but maybe the world is the way it is because no one thought to try to make it different. And as long as what you're doing makes the world different in a better way, then it feels like a worthy pursuit.
Right. Yeah, we may have a little bit of a common thread there. I think when I was a little kid, I was probably pretty annoying or frustrating, I could say, to my parents, to teachers, when I would always be asking why and trying to figure out why things were the way they were, which doesn't always work well when you're a little kid. But I tried to keep that curious mind and always investigate things a little bit further. I guess by anyone's standards, Max is a very successful platform, but can you reflect on some of the challenges along the way, or even perhaps some of the low points that you experienced?
Sure. Well, we started out with a concept. We didn't know if it would work. We didn't know if we could build the technology. We didn't know if anyone would use it. And when we launched the first version of our software, it turned out that one of our original hypotheses was completely wrong. We thought that all of these affluent households already had high yield savings accounts, and all they would need to do is link them to our platform, and then our software could help them manage their accounts. And it turned out we were completely wrong. It turned out almost no one had high yield savings accounts. Even today, only about 10% of the population has a high yield savings account. But we believe that the future of banking looks an awful lot like the future of the retail sector, where there's been a big movement to e-commerce. And if you think about it, when Amazon started, right, they started with a very simple idea, which is we'll sell college textbooks online. And because we don't have a physical brick and mortar store, we'll have lower operating costs. We'll be able to sell the textbooks at a better price point and gain share over time. And that's effectively what an online bank is, right? They're selling the commodity product, which is an FDIC insured savings account. at a better price point. But what Amazon figured out is, wait a minute, they didn't need to be the seller of textbooks. They just needed to be the marketplace that could match up buyers and sellers. And that's effectively what we're doing. We're matching up depositors with banks in a really efficient way. And in the result, getting people better pricing. So where we were wrong early on is we thought people already had these high yield savings accounts. No one had them. And we would just send people off to the online banks to go navigate their websites and open accounts. And that was a total disaster. No one could figure it out. No one wanted to fill out 5 different application forms, and no one wants any more logins and passwords online. And so that was really clunky. And we decided that we needed to figure out a way to do better. And so we devoted a lot of time and energy over several years trying to figure out how we could solve this problem. And ultimately what we came up with is something called the Max Common application that enables you to fill out a single form and open multiple bank accounts in parallel in about 2 minutes end to end. No logins, no passwords, no trial deposits, really, really simple. And that turned out to be the key, or one of the key innovations in turning this from sort of that niche science fair project into something that was really broadly applicable. So you could sort of think of the first version as a prototype, and we had to figure out how do you improve upon the prototype to make something that is broadly accessible. And so that was an early struggle we went through.
And you would never be where you are today without those struggles and iterations along the way. So wrapping up, Gary, you've been interviewed many times. Is there a question that you've always wished someone would ask you, but they never have?
Oh, gosh. It's a great question. I think this question actually is a question I wish people had asked me.
I know it's a little bit of a goofy question, but curious.
Well, there's something that's been on my mind recently, actually. There's a guy named Arthur Brooks, who he's had a really interesting career. He was a French horn player and then an academic, and then he was president of the American Enterprise Institute, and now he's a professor at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. So he's had a really interesting career, and he's one of my favorite podcasts to listen to. But I saw him speak not too long ago. He was hosting a talk at one of the clubs in New York City, and it was titled "Happiness in the Second Half of Your Life." And I had just turned 40, so I said, okay, well, this is probably the second half of my life. And I went to the talk, and every other person in the room was in their 70s and 80s. And I stayed. I was like, well, that's great. We're all in the same boat together. Let me learn about happiness. And it was fascinating because he talked about measures of life satisfaction. And I guess, scientists have studied, and they measure people, and people fill out surveys. How satisfied are you with your life? And they do these longitudinal studies of people over many decades. And they find that people are happy in their teens a little bit, but they're happier in their 20s, and they're even happier in their 30s, and they're even happier in their 40s, and they're even happier in their 50s. And this was a study of people who were, I think it was college graduates or people who were like bright and really intellectually engaged. And then they found a giant fork in the road. And as people got into their 60s and 70s and 80s, there were 2 cohorts of people. Half of them reported continued to be happier and happier every decade. 60s were better than my 50s, my 70s were better than my 60s, and so on and so forth. And the other half began to get more pessimistic. And 60s were not as good as my 50s, and my 70s were not as good as my 60s. And it posed a sort of really interesting quandary, which is, why is this the case, and what's the difference between these 2 groups of people? And you might think that, oh, well, it's based on health, because obviously your physical health and your mental health are really important to overall life satisfaction. But it turned out that wasn't the distinguishing characteristic. It turned out that these were all high achieving people who were surveyed, and they had always measured themselves by how quickly they could think, right? And when you think about how you excel in your job or in school or in your job early in your career, it's all about how quickly you can come up with the answer. And so that's how these people were sort of measuring themselves and valuing themselves. But as you get older, you start to build up a tremendous amount of accumulated knowledge. And where, my brain may not work quite as quickly as it did when I was in my 20s, I know an awful lot more than I did when I was in my 20s. And I've got the benefit of that life experience. And so he found that the key to happiness was the difference between the people who were frustrated by the fact that they couldn't think as quickly versus the people who felt gratified by the fact that they knew more and they could share that with the next generation. And so his big takeaway from this research, which is totally off topic and has nothing to do with cash or anything we've been talking about today.
No, this is interesting.
But the takeaway from that is that the key to happiness in the second half of your life, however you define that, is sharing your knowledge and wisdom with others. And that whether you do it through volunteering or becoming a teacher or passing along lessons to your grandchildren, or however you do that, appreciating that your worth, which you may have previously measured based on how quickly you could answer math problems, has evolved into the wisdom that you've accumulated. And I found that sort of so powerful. And I've really, been thinking a lot about that. And I hope to take that with me and continue to be happier in each subsequent decade.
No, thanks for sharing that. That's really interesting. And I think our listeners will take something away from that, because all of our clients are on what they would consider the second half of their lives, or the second act, you could say. Sharing what you know. I think I'll have to mull that over of how to go about that too. That could be a whole nother podcast episode in itself. Well, I will include a link in the show notes for all of our listeners who wish to create their own MaxMyInterest account. And there will also be a link to the website that Gary mentioned, where you can find more information, check out the frequently asked questions, and so on. But Gary, it's been a pleasure chatting with you today. And thank you so much for your time and expertise and sharing this with our listeners today.
Likewise, Lauren. It's been a lot of fun.
Once again, I hope you really enjoyed this conversation, but more than anything, this show is about taking action. Gary mentioned competitors in terms of 3 separate concepts, which also happen to be the 3 biggest reasons people fail to take action: awareness, apathy, and inertia. Awareness is having knowledge of the issue, and thanks to Gary sharing his time with us for this interview, I hope everyone can see the problem with most cash holdings and also the solution MaxMyInterest provides. That leaves apathy and inertia. Apathy means I know I could be doing better, but it's just not a priority. I often see this when we fail to think of the long-term compounding effect. In this case, I think it's helpful to extrapolate the amount of interest you could be earning instead of just in 1 year, perhaps 10, 20, or 30 years over the course of your retirement. And finally, inertia. It's always easiest to keep doing what we are already doing, even when it is not in our best interest. This is true of just about everything in life, and you can probably think of a few personal examples where you continue to do something even though you knew you could improve things with a different course of action. The good news is, while some changes are difficult, getting started with Max is about as easy of a process as you'll come by. And if you want to add a little extra motivation, I think it's always helpful for people to think about what they would do with some additional cash. Maybe you would go on a vacation, spend it on the grandkids, or if you simply don't need the money and want to give it back, perhaps you find a charity that shares your values and donate it to them. Every action in life can become more powerful when we have a strong why behind it. That will do it for this episode, and if you are new to the show, check out healthywealthywiseretirement.com for all past episodes, and you can submit new ideas for future episodes there too. We will be back in just 2 weeks. Be well, and God bless.
Thank you so much for listening and supporting this podcast. If you've enjoyed listening, we would love if you took a quick moment to leave an honest review. Of course, we're shooting for 5 stars, but if you have suggestions to improve the show, we would love to hear from you too. Just click on the podcast name, Healthy, Wealthy, and Wise Retirement Podcast, and scroll down to ratings and review. Thanks again for your support, as this helps us reach a wider audience and help even more retirees just like you. This podcast is for entertainment and informational purposes only and is not intended as a specific tax, legal, or investment advice. Lauren Sherman is a certified financial planner and co-owner of Integrity Wealth Management, an investment advisor serving retirees in search of their own healthy, wealthy, and wise retirement lifestyle.